When you have that kind of leadership as someone who says, I recognize my privilege, but I also recognize that there's a need for the government to play a role in that, I think that's where we're our better selves as a country. I think right now we're going through this period of asking that question. Is the role of government really there to really promote and support a diverse democracy? And I think we're grappling with that issue as a country right now.
We already know what helps. Connection is the cure. It's our deep and meaningful relationships that give us hope and healing. Welcome to This Helps. I'm Marlon Morgan. Join us as we practice authentic and vulnerable conversations that inspire us to go deeper with the people in our own lives. Today, we are so excited to welcome Augustus Mays to the show. Andrea, tell us more.
We're so excited, like you said, to have the Vice President of Partnerships and Engagement at the Education Trust, Augustus Mays, with us today. In his role at EdTrust, Augustus leads efforts to engage policymakers and advocates to enact equity-advancing policy changes at both the national and state levels. We're excited to dive into his wealth of experience and hear his insights on supporting our youth and advancing equity through policy change. Augustus, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Andrea and Marlon. I really appreciate it and glad to be here.
Well, we've been planning this for a while, and Augustus, you and I have known each other for some time now, and you have done some incredible work around equity, around furthering certain policy in education, making sure that students truly aren't left behind, not to steal a phrase from the early 2000s. But I want to know just overall, how did you get to this point? Tell us your trajectory, your career journey of how you got to be a VP at EdTrust.
Yeah, thanks, Marlon. And again, good to see you. Always great to be in fellowship with you. So glad to be here today. Yeah, so my story, my personal story is it really began with my parents, right? Both were first-gen college grads. And like most, Black families in America, especially in the middle of the 20th century, and currently now, we're living in abject poverty, and we're sort of part of how the system sort of provided them with that type of life. And education was the ladder up for them, right? And they saw that in terms of the opportunities that they had. My father was in the military, so the GI Bill allowed him college access and opportunities to get further his education and his skill set to, be employable in the workforce. My mother also, her family instilled in her the importance of education and how that could be a ladder up for her in terms of economic mobility. So all that is to say, as they raised me and my sister, they, were very honest with me about the economic and racial barriers that certain systems in our country had set up for Black people, people of color, low-income people. And so my father very early on instilled in me, his upbringing, but the opportunity education provided him, but the realistic, circumstances that most people who look like me face. And he made sure that I knew at a very early age that my calling in life, my purpose in life should be to try to make lives for all people, but especially people of color, better. And so whatever I wanted to focus on in terms of my education and my profession, that should be my calling. How can I make the world a better place for all people, but particularly those who have been historically marginalized? So for me, even in college and throughout my career, social justice has been my focus. Ed policy in particular has been my focus. And so I've been in the ed policy space here in DC for over 15 years. I've always worked for organizations that have centered racial equity at the heart of our work. And so coming to EdTrust was a natural fit, given that this organization historically, all the way from Katie Haycock to John King, who you had on your show, to Denise Fort, who is now leading this work, have centered equity and access for all students, but particularly finding the policies as well as the data that we need to uplift about the inequities in our system so that every kid has a chance to not not be left behind, but have the opportunity of a sound basic education.
What does it sound like from a family member to hear some of those realities about the system that you're about to enter or that you've already entered just by being born?
Yeah, I mean, for me, again, I can remember like I was 11 years old, brushing my teeth with my dad, as we did every morning. As we were getting ready, he was going to work, I was going to school. And I can just remember we had just gotten back that weekend from visiting our family in Denver. That's where my father's from. And I can just remember at 11 years old saying to him, why is it that, my cousins, my aunts and uncles have to struggle so much and we don't? It just didn't make sense to me because obviously, right? They're good people. They're great people. They're hardworking, harder working than I was or I am right now. But it was really, he said to me in that moment, it's really about opportunity. And you have to have, you know, educational opportunities that then will lead to work opportunities that will lead to a better life for your family. And because of certain structures within our society and with our system, right, in terms of the economy, in terms of government, et cetera, it wasn't set up for everyone. And so he just really made that clear for me that I was asking the right question, and he was very proud of me for doing so. But that's where that calling, right, of there's there's more to life than just focusing on yourself, that you can be a change agent in this world if you truly hone in on the work that matters, that can uplift people within your community and personally people within your family. And so every day when I come to work, I mean, it's obviously about, like you said, promoting educational equity, creating more opportunities for students. But every day I have three kids. I have a 13-year-old, 10-year-old, and 6-year-old, young, brilliant Black minds. But I know that they represent millions of kids who look like them that don't have similar opportunities. And so for me, every day when I see the opportunities they have, I want to ensure that in the policies I'm advocating for, the resources and funding that we're trying to advocate for here at EdTrust at the national level in the states, that the same opportunities my kids have and the zip code that they live in can be transferable to any, locality, district in this country, that every kid, especially those who look like my children, have the same opportunities. And so that fuels me, that motivates me. I know the work is, far from being where we want it to be, but I also see the brilliance that a lot of educators, a lot of school support staff across this country are already doing. There's a lot of brilliant things going on in public schools that always don't get uplifted, and we want to make sure that those bright spots are being highlighted and that people understand that public schools do work for families, they do work for students, they deliver, but we need to replicate those successes and make sure that policymakers in particular are putting forth policies that will support that kind of schooling.
What are you most excited about? What are some of these things that are working?
Um, so at EdTrust, there are conditions, right, within schools that we're trying to uplift. I think the first thing, I'm excited to see that there are a lot of states now, like in Michigan, for example, in Maryland, for example, in California, where you are, that have really centered resource equity at the heart of how they fund and resource schools. That means you're not just sort of focused on how many kids you have in your school and that sort of dictates the funding that, say, a school receives. It's really about the needs of every student, right? We know the diversity of this democracy, the diversity of our students. There are different needs that students have. Maybe you're a student with an IEP. You have a particular learning disability. You need supports that you need there. So your district or your school should get additional funding for that. Or maybe it's, you're an English language learner and your bilingualism is your brilliance. But we need to make sure that the educators in that school, right, have the professional learning opportunities to help, develop their craft so they can meet you where you are as a student. So states have adopted new funding formulas like California. It's not necessarily new, but, like the local control funding formula in California, where you're really centering the student as the locus of change in terms of how you're funding schools. And so that's really exciting. Other areas I would say that are really exciting to see is that even though in this midst of policies, especially at the federal level and the state level of the government, this administration trying to push back against DEI, I think there has been a lot of movement around cultural responsive teaching in education. I think educators are coming to their classrooms every day, being incentivized to really understand the differences in their students as a strength and really adjusting their instructional practices to meet the cultural needs of their students. I think the diversifying the educator workforce over the past few years, several years, has been really important. Again, we're already in our school system a majority minority country, but a very small percentage of our teachers are educators of color. But we know what the research says about what an educator of color means in a student's life, and that's all students: white kids, black kids, brown kids. Just the cultural diversity of who is in front of them, teaching them, and the cultural richness that they bring to their education every day is important. So really, really happy and excited to see that. And then I will say, and this is really important for your podcast, right, in terms of mental health, right? We're in an endemic right now in terms of how mental health is really pervasive in a negative way, in the sense of loneliness, not feeling engaged or attached to the environments that students feel that they're a part of. And I will say, at least in the past few years at the federal level, it's been nice to see the investment in having more school psychologists, more school counselors, really focusing on the root causes of particular behavioral issues in schools as opposed to hardening sort of strategies. So really trying to look at the social and emotional supports that are needed to support kids. But that's all also coupled with the current environment, though, that there appears to be a lack of resources that has been recently canceled to sort of support that. But I think we've been excited, at least at the state and local level, that people truly understand to really create a thriving school environment where every kid feels welcome, every kid feels engaged, that you really have to provide the mental and social and emotional supports within a school to really sort of see a change in trajectory in terms of how kids feel a part or engaged, or a sense of belonging to the school and the educators in that building and their fellow students. So I think the focus on that has been really, really heightened because of all the things we're seeing around chronic absenteeism and also school engagement or student engagement. And so I'm really pleased to see at least state and local leaders and educators leaning in on that issue.
I want you to help us understand a few things. You've used some terms that I think could use some unpacking for people
Sure.
who maybe majority, minority. What does that mean?
It means that by 2040, the majority of citizens in this country will be of non-white descent. And obviously, just in terms of the history of this country, I think that is important, one, because I think diversity is a strength and always has been of this country. The American story has not just been one of white Americans, it's been one of Black Americans, Native Americans, Latino Americans, right? And so the fact that we're moving towards a country that is very diverse also means that we need to change and also adapt to the systems and structures that are in place that will uplift this majority-minority democracy that we live in. And so, I think that's what's in question right now in terms of how this current administration and certain people in this country who voted for this administration sort of view that as not as an opportunity to further grow the richness and strength of this country. It's seen as a threat, right? It's seen as a huge change or shift. And so I think we're seeing a recalibration of how people view this majority-minority sort of reality that we're about to enter. But I will say, I do believe, right? Like, I think folks, when they understand, organizations like EdTrust who are really trying to help folks realize that it's important to embrace diversity, because diversity is patriotic. It is important to embrace diversity because when you look at the future of work, what jobs will be created, who will be doing those jobs, how that'll benefit all of us in terms of economy, like supporting efforts like this to, especially through education, to ensure that we're preparing the next generation to be leaders in this country, to be innovators in this country. It's really just important that we educate folks, that don't be afraid or scared of the terminology you're hearing about, say, DEI as an acronym, but really understand what's underneath that and why it matters, and why we all should be embracing the diversity and the inclusion that we should be supporting in this country.
During a backlash on DEI and sort of a pendulum swing we're seeing in that direction that you just mentioned, are there, you being in DC, knowing a lot of the history that comes with fighting for equal rights, are there any presidents or administrations that you look at and you say, okay, some things are being undone right now, but they had
Yeah.
to be done. Someone had to do them. Because sometimes it gives me hope to read about or think about people who had a position of power that worked to unite, that worked to get equal rights. All these things that are in jeopardy are things that exist. And we live at a time when they exist. And maybe just 50 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, some of the things that we're talking about weren't even an issue because they had not been brought up yet.
Yeah, I'll give you two periods, I think, within our country's recent time that I think has sort of uplifted the importance of public education and the federal role. So one is, I think, during President Johnson, the Johnson administration during the mid 1960s, his Great
LBJ.
Society, LBJ, his Great Society program, where he was really trying to address poverty for all of our citizens, but the real issue of poverty, and as my parents' story, right? How can the government, the federal government, play a role in lifting people up? How can they make the conditions of their lives better so that not only it improves them and their families for generations, but also improves the strength of the country? And so within that Great Society, there were key civil rights programs like the Voters' Rights Act, right?
Mhm.
Which expanded access and opportunity for all people to vote, but particularly, people of color in the South, in the Jim Crow South, that didn't have opportunities, or that were sort of pushed away to have the opportunity to vote. Something that, again, we all see as a civil right in this country today, and through our Constitution was supposed to be available to all. That's one area. Another part of it, though, in the education space was the authorization that Congress passed and President Johnson signed, which was the Elementary, Secondary, and Education Act, which created a variety of programs. Because the way our education system is set up, the majority of funding comes from state and localities. So over 90% of funding in our country comes from like property taxes, comes from other revenue or taxes in a particular state. So depending on the wealth or the affluence of your school district, that really dictated, right, your ability to have a high quality education. So what the Elementary Secondary Education Act did was create programs that provided those additional funding supports to those communities, predominantly those that serve low income people or people of color, to at least level the playing field so they could have educational opportunities. That's one thing that did that. And then I think in fast forward to about 10, 15 years or 15 years later with President Carter, he established and created the U.S. Department of Education, which is currently in the news a lot because President Trump and his administration wants to dismantle the department, wants to eliminate it. But during the creation of the U.S. Department of Ed back in 1979, it was really, really important that agency was created because we saw over decades what state governments and local governments were not doing on behalf of all students, right? We saw
Why did Carter want to develop this U.S. Department of Ed in the first place. So I think you were getting to that, but I wanted to bring people along because I
Yeah.
think that's an important question to ask. If we're possibly going to lose something, we should know why it was enacted or built.
Yeah, and primarily one, it was to increase civil rights protections for those, again, communities that weren't receiving a sound basic education that is a civil right for them. And the fact of the matter was, we were at that time, right, only over 10 years into integrating our schools, meaning that you know black and brown kids could go to the same schools that white kids were going to, and we had slowly implemented that, but it wasn't implemented in a way that was ensuring that equity was at the center of how all students were treated. So he wanted to create an agency at the federal level that would oversee civil rights protections for, say, how black and brown students are treated if they're suspended or expelled, or the right for English language learners to receive a sound basic education. The Department of Ed would provide those civil rights protections to ensure that would happen. The other piece was around the funding piece, right? Like I said, 10% of schools are receive funding from the federal government, but for those low wealth districts, that 10% is really like 20%, right? Or 25% in some circumstances. So, large urban school districts or rural school districts, right, receive less funding because their property value or their local taxes don't generate enough revenue for their state to provide them with funding. So President Carter and Congress at that time realized, oh, we need to really elevate this agency to really focus on resources and supports for schools. And then the last thing was, the Department of Ed used to be under the Health and Education Workforce Agency, which did a lot of things, right? It did healthcare policy, it did workforce policy and education policy. And so really pulling that out from that agency that was doing a number of things and really focusing an agency that was really an expert in education, knew how to provide supports and services to states and districts on education, really, I think, uplifted the expertise of the federal government to really hire staff, people who understood schools, understood kids and the education that they needed. And so I think over the past 40 years, we've seen an agency, not perfect, right? And I'm not here to say that the federal government has done an excellent job in supporting state schools and districts in providing a high quality education to every kid. But that role around civil rights protections, around resource equity or funding, and just the agency's sort of focus on ensuring that high quality programs and services are getting to every kid in this country has been essential and has made a difference, right, in terms of the education I received, because I'm a product of the federal government and that agency and what it's done and provided in terms of education for me personally. I wouldn't be sitting where I am today, in the role that I'm in, the position that I am in, and the influence that I think I have, if it weren't for what the federal government has done and the U.S. Department of Ed has done for people like me.
So I'm hearing that 10 years after segregation, some states, I know it's hard to believe, but some states were not. I can be, so I'm not this. I don't have to be quite as polite, and I really, Augustus, appreciate the eloquent way that you are sharing this. I think it makes it easy to understand and really helps people not be defensive if they've heard other things. But what I'm hearing is that even though it might be hard to believe, 10 years after desegregation, um, some states were still not putting the same amount of resources toward education in some areas as other areas. And so what Jimmy Carter did, which I think everyone on earth can agree, no matter what, I don't know if there's a closer thing to a patron saint as a president. I think that's why he didn't win again. It's because he was actually too kind, too generous,
Right.
and people that scared people. But
Hmm.
he decided that he was going to take and build on LBJ's Civil Rights Act, in some of the Labor Act, some of the hundreds of policies that LBJ enacted, and
Hmm.
put together a bit of accountability so that we could even things out a little bit across states when it comes to resources and education. Is that somewhat what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, to be blunt, right? We know what states did when there wasn't any oversight and accountability in how they provided, again, which is in a lot of states' constitutions, they're supposed to provide a sound basic education for every citizen. I would say almost every state, if you take a look at their constitution, education is a pillar, as a priority in their constitution, and they're supposed to deliver on that. But we know the history of this country, right? The history of this country was that not every not every person was seen as equal. Obviously, in terms of our history through slavery, Jim Crow, all of the things, it really required at some point, and thankfully, as our country has grown and evolved, has done the morally right things, right? We've become a more inclusive democracy, and education has been sort of one of the key areas where we try to really infuse that. So I think you've seen it since one, really, the Brown versus Board Education Supreme Court decision in 1954, leading to the Civil Rights Act era in the mid 60s. We've seen the federal government's role, especially when people are experiencing hardship or need access to opportunity. The federal government has played a critical role to, again, leveling the playing field so everyone has at least access to that opportunity and the resources to do it. And so I think what I'm trying to say is in education, since the the creation of the Department of Ed, the Department of Ed was needed because we know when states are left to their own devices, most of them, they're not going to make sure that every student with the IEP or has a learning disability is going to be in the same classroom with, the rest of the students in the class, right? They're going to be, if we left it up to states, a lot of states were not educating every student with a disability. They were putting them in separate classrooms. They were educating them in basements, really, right? Not
Mm-hmm.
providing them the quality services that they needed. Or again, if it was left up to the devices of some states, right? Students who look like me would not be able to go to the same schools, right? That their more white affluent students or peers were going to. So again, it's the federal government's sort of protection of the civil rights within education that I think is the most critical conversation that we're having right now. Is that if the federal backstop goes away, you're taking us back to a time where every kid didn't have the same opportunity in terms of an education that they need. And I think a lot of Americans would say if you told them, and we've polled them, right? Um, Survey after survey, public education and their neighborhood school matters to them. It's one of the most important things, one of the most important kitchen table issues that they really focus on. The problem is they really don't understand, and that's what we're trying to do at EdTrust, is get them to understand what the actual U.S. Department of Ed actually does for their student, does for their school, does for their economy. And I think if we can further educate folks about what the Department of Ed really does for them, I think all of these narratives and misinformation that's being put out there about what the federal government hasn't done, what the U.S. Department of Ed is doing to education in states, I think folks would wake up and realize, wait, I really don't want that right taken away from my kid or any kid in this country. The federal government and the U.S. Department of Ed is critical.
I guess it's with at risk of missing out on some of the. You've written some incredible articles of which I've read, and you continue to be the voice for people who don't necessarily have one or don't have as loud of a voice, and fight for policies and truly are doing the work of the heroes that you're sort of talking about. It's interesting that you brought up LBJ and Jimmy Carter because those are two people that I've been sort of um, reading about and have been inspiring me during this time
Hmm.
to know that that's even possible. And I think if you're open to it, would you be okay going through some of what happened so that we can help remind people or sort of increase understanding of what was happening in this country during the 1960s to now and how we got here and why we might need to preserve some of these things?
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say again, I mean, it really starts at the the inception of this country, right? Its original sin in
Hmm.
terms of using the institution of slavery as a means to, you know, one, use unpaid labor
Mm.
to increase the wealth, generational wealth of a few. In terms of, you know, white males in this country, our founding fathers and others who didn't really address, uh, you know, the original sin, which was allowing slavery to be a part of our economic, political, and social system. And then fast forward to, right, you know, we had a war over this, a consequential one, the Civil War, and really the Reconstruction era post Civil War really advanced, right? Still, this separate but equal society that we are living in, that, you know, Black folk in particular weren't allowed to go to the same schools, weren't given sort of the same legal representation and opportunities to advance themselves or their lives in terms of work, or to be seen as an equal citizen in some areas of this country, particularly in the South. And that systemic, you know, racist approaches in terms of our institutions in this country persisted for almost another 50, 60 years. And because of that, you know, we saw not just, you know, Black folk, but also other people of color who didn't have the economic and political power to truly, um, you know, advance their lives from an economic and political standpoint. And so it really came to a head in the middle of the 20th century as we saw, right, the, you know, the country get through two major world wars, people returning, you know, after World War II, returning home to an economy that was very strong, a middle class that was growing, and the advent of almost, you know, what we're seeing now with social media, television, and other things that were really opening people's eyes to what is actually happening around the country. So you had folks, civil rights leaders like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, others, right, who were at that time really uplifting the Black experience, uh, the poor experience in this country, and showing what the haves and have-nots were really having access to, and really were pushing, right, change, you know, through mobilization and organizing of Black, brown, white people, a diverse coalition of people who really truly believed in the American dream, right, that everyone should have an opportunity to that through, you know, education, through employment opportunities, et cetera, but realizing that the government was not doing its part to create the conditions for everyone to actually be able to pursue the American dream. So you saw, you know, again, at least in the education space, in the mid 1950s, with the Brown versus Board Supreme Court decision led by Supreme Court Justice, you know, Thurgood Marshall and others on that court, that really recognized the constitutional crisis that we had when it came to providing a sound basic education for every child. And so that decision really changed everything in 1954 when the Supreme Court, and usually, and we've seen it today, the courts are really holding strong on a lot of constitutional issues that are trying to be pushed to the side or stepped over, and saying, no, 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 you can't do that because here's what our Constitution says. And I think during that period, we saw the court stand up, and then that led to a grassroots movement that we then saw again, as I said, during the 1960s, where, you know, every day on the news you were seeing, you know, you know, atrocities being
You
put
were
on Black
seeing
folk
the
in the South.
march. Yeah, the
Yeah.
march in Selma. You were seeing Dr. King get murdered. You were seeing Bobby Kennedy get killed. You were seeing anyone who had any ideas that wanted to move things forward for people without a voice. You know, and which is also, you were seeing Vietnam. You were seeing all kinds of things that you didn't used to see now in those days.
So it's real for folks, right? They were seeing that, right? And so,
It's hard to ignore it.
yeah, they couldn't ignore it. They wanted to get involved. And so there was enough, again, I think all major changes in this country generally start from grassroots movements, but it requires leadership. It requires a moment in time where our principles and values as a country are being tested. And so I think, I think we're in that moment now too. I think where we're seeing a lot of things that are being done to certain communities that feel like that's not American. That's not the way in which, I believe or see my neighbor, see my country sort of representing me. And so I think hopefully we'll have folks who, stand up, rise up, and make sure that the country continues to head in the path it should.
I want to verbally process something through a non-academic lens and see if you'll walk with me, Augustus, while we
Sure.
have just a little time together. So it's hard to imagine the 1960s being so close. I mean, it really wasn't that long ago. Many people who, are alive now remember this time. But when, and there's this whole LBJ thing, which you brought up earlier, where if you just look at a picture of Lyndon Baines Johnson,
There you
you
go.
would
Yeah.
think maybe this guy is a person who might have some racist views. He's from the South.
He
But
did. Let's be honest. He did.
yeah, he did. He did. You
Yeah.
might look at him and say that. But then he also, when it was time, signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. He did also, the labor the Labor Act, I think was something he pushed forward.
The Voters'
But
Rights Act of 1965, that was huge.
voters, yes. So it almost felt like, and he had sort of a similar style as our current president, I would say, in a different direction that you would not expect. And I think a lot of people in the South, segregated states, saw it as a huge betrayal on their part. And he made a comment one time. He said, once we sign this act, we're turning over the South to the Republican Party. And that's really been voting that way ever since, which is interesting. But I think to get into some of the actual words that were said during this time, I have a quote here because I recently was reading a book by one of LBJ's domestic affairs consultants, and he said, it's Joseph Califano, and he said that a Southern governor like George Wallace of Alabama had declared, from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of Anglo-Saxon Southland, I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. End quote. And so for Jimmy Carter to just one decade later, not even, come up with the idea that the federal government could even things out a little bit or have some accountability for states who weren't, but segregating schools is one thing, but this was during a time you couldn't even use the same drinking fountain as the person who was white. Like a black person could not use same drinking fountain. They couldn't go to the same restaurants. This is still happening. So I just think it's very helpful to remind people. And like I said, myself, this was just happening. George Wallace died in 1998. That's when I graduated high school.
Yeah.
And then, but then he also had, you kind of see Johnson come in and not surprisingly blaming George Wallace for a lot of what was happening. And his quote, he called George Wallace a runty little bastard and just about the most dangerous person around with a powerful constituency. And moving forward, I thought that was good. And then Califano kind of goes back and tells us the first three things that Johnson wanted him to do when he came on as an advisor, now that he had actually won the presidency and not just been succeeded.
Right.
And he took him to his ranch, swam to a place in the pool that at 6'3", LBJ could stand. And Califano at 5'10" could not stand in the pool, had to tread water, started talking to him. and started pointing his finger at him and telling him
Classic
all
LBJ.
a
Yep.
classic Baines Johnson,
Yes.
man. And so he started pointing at him and pushing him down the water while he was treading water and said, there's three things I want to tell you. And the first one, he went on about consolidating the transportation mess in this country. The second was rebuilding American cities. And finally, this is a quote, and I'm going to read what's in between the quotes so you understand the moment. And he says, third, I want a fair housing bill. We've got to end this goddamn discrimination until people, and then he stops and says, then he started jabbing my shoulder as he recited each color, back to the quote, whether they're purple, brown, black, yellow, red, green, or whatever, live together. They'll never know that they have the same hopes for their children, the same fears, troubles, woes, ambitions. I want that bill to make it possible for anyone to buy a house anywhere they can afford to. Now, can you do that? Can you do all these things? And he was
Yeah.
pushing him down into the deep end of the pool. And of course he said, yes, sir, Mr. President, and did all of those and did work to do most of those things. But I think that story points out that you can use bullyish leadership in both directions. It doesn't make
Yes.
sense why he did it that way or how, but he did get it done.
I appreciate you, walking us through that history of LBJ and his leadership, because I think a lot of folks should also, as we're talking about this president, LBJ, and his impact that he had, right, on really trying to address what he was critical part of his administration was the war on poverty. Yes, he had the Vietnam War. Yes, he had other things, but his signature domestic policy was the war on poverty, and I think a lot of that was grounded, and this is so important, in his lived experience. I mean, he came from a very rural, desolate, poor area in Texas. Grew up with not much, to his name or his family's name, to really, really truly live the American dream. So he understood. I mean, he evolved on the issue of race in this country, and he also saw sort of the headwinds in terms of the political reality. That people of color were growing in number and in influence in this country in terms of
constituency and votership.
Yeah. So he understood that, but he came at this work truly through his being a poor young white boy in Texas and ascending to the highest office in the land and understanding what government could do in terms of changing people's lives. And so I think that's where his populism, we're going to talk about populism, the current president tries to own that label, but his populism, Johnson's, and I think, many presidents after him, Republican and Democrat, recognize that the federal government plays a role in people's lives to really improve it. And so I think what you're seeing right now in our country's politics is that ever since, 2010 and the rise of the Tea Party and the Obama administration's push to expand that Great Society promise that Johnson did, right? So the Obama years really tried to build upon, the Affordable Care Act, right? Providing affordable health care to every American in this country, because that's a civil right, and expanded the government's role there. Or how, the government expanded in various other sectors, because he was trying to build a vision of, over this, it wasn't so long ago, right, during the Johnson years that we created this infrastructure, but now it's time to improve it, to ensure that equity is really at the center of everything. And I think you saw a lot of people, and from an ideological standpoint, like conservatives were really, really concerned, especially small government conservatives. What does this mean? I have to pay for all these services for, all these people that maybe I don't really see myself aligned with. What is the return on investment? And then others saw it as just a threat to white supremacy, right? And the normal sort of ways in which this country sort of benefited, the white sort of approach, or the white culture that, was pervasive in this country for hundreds of years, and that the country was changing, and government was forcing that change. And so you saw the advent of the Tea Party, you saw the MAGA movement be created, because it was really, getting people to sort of base their ideology, their vote, their opinions on sort of race ideology in terms of it's us against them or they're against us because they're different, as opposed to really seeing, as Johnson did, right, that we need to make sure everyone sees themselves as Americans, but we do also recognize that there are inequities in this country, inequities in our systems that are preventing Black, brown, people of color from having the same opportunity as me, the president of the United States. And so when you have that kind of leadership of someone who says, I recognize my privilege, but I also recognize that there's a need for the government to play a role in that. I think that's where we're our better selves as a country. But I think right now we're going through this period of asking that question: is the role of government really there to really promote and support a diverse democracy? And I think we're grappling with that issue as a country right now.
That's a great point. And let's wrestle with it. Let's talk. Let's tell the truth. Let's stop denying that any of this stuff is actually happening. I think that's a real issue that I would love to see people just be able to let in the truth of the matter, because if you don't have truth, you can never have the grace that we need to heal.
Amen. Yes.
But Augustus, as you work every day to change these systems, and as you open your news app, whatever it is in the morning, and see things that may or may not be helpful to all people and towards moves towards equity, what do you do personally to stay motivated, to stay positive, to not get uh, so angry and so frustrated that it makes you want to stop doing this?
I think first of all, I think for me, it's, I know that my ancestors, right, definitely dealt with situations that were worse in terms of their lived experience and their circumstances, but they continued to fight. I think there's always been joy within the civil rights movement, right? Like, even though life circumstances dealt all of us, especially Black folks, right, the hardest hand that could ever be dealt, we still found joy and hope in the cause of trying to fight for a better life for our kids. And I think that always motivates me every day, in the sense that I know my ancestors faced similar circumstances or even harder circumstances that we're in now, and they still saw the joy and the optimism in what this country could be. So that always motivates me. And then the other part is I have to show up, right? I feel like I tell people my job is more than just it's not a job. It's my lived experience. It's that's what really motivates me, is that like I said to you before earlier in my remarks, like, I do this for my kids, I do this for my wife, I do this for my family, my extended family. And I know if I don't show up in this way to create knowledge and understanding of what's happening, why it matters, and where we should be leaning in as a country, but as a community, then who else is going to do that? And so for me, it's a personal obligation to show up in the right way, in the sense that I know I can make a difference. I can make a change, even if it's small and incremental. I'm moving towards that greater good that we all want for this country, which is a diverse, inclusive democracy.
Using history to keep perspective and saying, if it's not me, then who?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the two things that you're sharing with us that keep you going. I think they can keep us all going. You are an inspiration, what you are doing, and sticking around there in DC, where things are, there's a lot of people moving away or maybe even giving up, but you are continuing to fight the fight and be a voice for people when they need it most. And I want to thank you for that, Augustus, and thank you for the work that you continue to do.
I appreciate you, Marlon. I appreciate you and your leadership too, and the work that you do on behalf of students and families across this country. You uplifting these issues and giving us space to talk about them is so important for us to, as you said, heal and move forward. So I appreciate you for that too.
Is there anywhere that people can stay connected to what you're doing, Augustus? That where can they find the articles that you're writing and some of the work that you're doing?
Yeah. So obviously you can go to edtrust.org, and all of our articles, our policy positions, the work that we do is available there. And then on our social platforms, on Instagram, on X, on Blue Sky, it's at EdTrust. And follow us, please, because a lot of the policy developments and reports and things that we put out, you can catch that information there.
Thank you so much. Thanks again, Augustus. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Marlon. Take care.
Welcome back to another exciting installment of Marlon Helps or at least tries. Already, folks can hear this is me, producer Andrea. Hannah is not with us today, so I'm going to try to steer this ship. I've got big shoes to fill.
Let's see how it goes.
Yep. And you're Marlon.
That's me.
Mm-hmm.
This is me trying.
Well, we'll see. We just finished our conversation with Augustus Mays.
Mm-hmm.
What'd you
Legend.
think?
I thought he was genuinely one of the sweetest people I've ever met, and I've actually known him for a few years now, and he's always like that. He's always talking about incredibly big and challenging topics, but in a way that is just makes you want to be his friend. So
I was trying to figure out how to really articulate what it is that he does so well, and it's like he's really good at kind of setting what's at stake and explaining what's most critical, but in a way that isn't too overwhelming. Like,
I feel like he's like, I hate to admit it, but I often, if I hear about a social issue, I'm so like tired and beleaguered from the internet that I would much rather have it in the form of a children's book. Just like a children's book that assumes some intelligence, but is also going to kindly put it to me in a way that I don't want to just turn off my phone or close the book. And that's, I feel like, Augustus Mays. He can put some very complex, difficult truths about humanity and society into a way that makes you want to help.
Yeah, absolutely. I have two related questions today. One I think is pretty straightforward and practical, and then the other one, I don't really know what I am expecting you to say, so we'll save that one for the second. But related directly to what you just said, he published an article in Word in Black that I'll link to in the show notes last month that is really fantastic. And at the end, he says, "We cannot stand by while this administration rewrites the rules and rewinds the clock on 6 decades of progress. Congress must act to protect students, and we, the public, must demand better for our kids, all of them." And I think that's a powerful call to action. And I think something you might be able to help folks with is maybe what can we, the public, do to demand better? What's like something practical?
Well, I'll just talk about what's helped me, because this has been a time where I couldn't just sit around and read the news and not do anything. And I think probably what's helped me most is something that Augustus just referred to, and that is gaining and keeping perspective. So, I think in order to make sure that in this attention economy, you continue to read articles and open your phone and click on notifications, people have to act like this is like novel human behavior, or any like a president being a dick is just like never happened before. And I will say this is a new magnitude of, and certainly different, and is what Augustus said, turning back the clock on a lot of progress in the name of efficiency a lot of times, or kind of, lack of a better word, whitewashing it, White Housing it. Is that a thing? That's a new thing.
Yeah.
But something that's helped me is going back to look at 6 decades of progress, because we have moved forward quite a bit since the mid 1960s, since the Civil Rights Act, and LBJ in his LBJ is not unlike Donald Trump in that he sees power as and the use of it as the way to get things done in just about, kind of whatever it takes.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's not always interested in the rules and how they apply or might apply to the executive branch. However, he took that strategy and passed a lot of policy through that has helped create equity in this country. He once gave an example of equity that I thought was probably the best one I've heard. And it was sort of a precursor to affirmative action. And he was talking about, I believe he was talking about the Labor Act and just kind of saying, we can't expect two runners who line up in the same place, but one who's been practicing for years and the other one who's been in chains for years to start at the same place and end up at the same place. We have to acknowledge that there have been some setbacks for certain populations and people. And that's the reason that he wanted to do that. And it sounds weird, when he's saying it, because it's coming from a white Southern man's mouth. And it is, but he was such an advocate, he grew into and evolved into such an advocate for people who were, in poverty or had a lot of things going against them based on where they were born or what they look like. And so it's helpful for me because it's not, sticking to your convictions, and there's a time to be a strong leader.
Mm-hmm.
And people have done that in the past. But if you're doing it for the right reasons, or you're doing it for things that'll help people, or you can acknowledge that there's a budget deficit and problem, but you can also push forward programs and be a force for good in sort of that whole idea of the Great Society that LBJ put forward. That has been, to answer your question, reading about people who have stepped up at important times in the past, especially in terms of politics or governments, whether it was Dr. Martin Luther King, LBJ, who you would obviously not expect, and for a lot of reasons, whether it was Jimmy Carter to come forward and create, for equity's sake and for education's sake, create the Department of Education at the federal level. So all these things that are being undone, or at least being attempted to be dismantled, they're things that had to get built in the first place.
That's right.
And that has been sort of hopeful to learn about that. So go to a used bookstore in a library, those little ones they have in the front, and cost you like $2. That's what I did, and found a really awesome book called the Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson, which was published in 1991, but has a new foreword now, published in, I think, 2017, and it's still totally relevant. And it's been a great read.
It's so important to put this stuff into context, and it can be really hard to live in this current moment and imagine it connected to a past or future. It's almost become a sort of like joke of living in unprecedented times, and so
yeah, they're kind of precedented though,
Yeah,
I just feel like they're more precedented.
That's right.
You know who wants you to think they're unprecedented? Anyone that has an ad to sell.
That's exactly right. Yep, that's exactly right.
There's a lot of horrible stuff happening. I'm not, and people are being oppressed, and we're going in the opposite direction with a lot of important issues. So I'm not saying it's not unprecedented in that way.
No.
I think it's unprecedented for all of this information to be in front of you all of the time, to see people. The internet can show you people at their best or at their worst, but often because of our negative bias, we prefer that negative information also. That's not helping.
Right. I think just kind of remembering that I'm not the one who's supposed to be giving advice right now, but I just keep thinking.
I wish you would.
Well, it's just really hard to think about, I'm not always the most optimistic person. And so it can be really easy to kind of think about this not being able to think about what it might be like a few decades from now in a positive light, to even imagine that we might have a few decades from now. And I think that's also part of it. And so, being able to look backward and forward at the same time, I think
there's going to be
so
ups and
necessary.
downs. And sometimes really bad situations create heroic and hopeful behavior.
Right. And it shouldn't have to happen.
I wish it didn't.
But I think if you lean too far into letting yourself kind of swim in that, it's going to be impossible to get to a point that is good. And so,
well, acknowledging when things are bad, I think is important. So I don't want to ignore it, but I think acknowledging they're bad is not enough.
right.
Acknowledging you can turn something horrible, as long as you're alive and have any kind of influence or breath in your lungs, you can turn something really horrible into something that is a little bit better than it was.
Mm-hmm.
And so many times as people, I'd rather just hear good news all day long. But to let it motivate us is a whole next step. To let bad news be a motivator, to not take on so much of it that you feel like you're drowning in it, and pick a few issues that you really care about and try to move forward with those issues and try to move those issues forward.
I think that's right. I think that's really helpful.
Well, what was that second question?
You led us right into it. The question was why, for a conversation with somebody who's working today right now on stuff that is really active and really pressing, so much of what the two of you talked about was our history. And I just thought that was really interesting and not necessarily the conversation everybody would have thought to have. And so I was just curious about what your motivation was there. And I think you just told us.
Right when I hear something like the Department of Ed's going away, it's something I took for granted that we would just always have it because
why wouldn't we?
What?
Yeah.
But yeah. And to go on record as saying, I think there's a lot of waste in the government and a lot of budgets that can be tightened up. I would just want to see that happen across the board and over a longer period of time so that we could, it's not like you can only create opportunity for people that don't have it, and that is what's costing a lot of money.
Right. Well, and I think to go back to that article from Augustus, I mean, he says, he writes, this is the playbook: sow chaos, starve public schools, demonize equity, and pretend privatization is the only solution left. But it's not wrong. It's un-American. That's part of the design of it, right? I know this isn't what our podcast is really about, but I don't think they think they're making the most savvy decisions. I don't think that's really what's going on.
You don't think thinks they're making the most savvy decisions?
Current administration. I don't think that choice, is one that is attempting to be made because they think it's the most useful or
cost
effective.
Efficient.
Yeah, I don't think it has anything to do with any of that, really.
No, I think it has to do with taking away power from anywhere and everywhere else, and that includes taking away money from anywhere and everywhere else.
Exactly.
I don't want to lose any of our listeners, but I also want to point out objective truths and say that I think we could do a better and kinder job of bringing truth to light, bringing truth to power, and then, like I said before, without actual truth of what's happening, you can't have the grace and the healing that it takes to grow. Thanks for joining us today. We hope it helped. Stay connected with us at thishelpspodcast.com.